So this is basically going to be almost all of year 12 macro. And this is really important because even in year 13, the questions are always about what are the impacts of something in the UK economy? So whenever it says impacts or consequences or effects on the UK economy, we always want to talk about the four objectives. So the four main macroeconomic objectives are 2% inflation, low unemployment, economic growth, and also a balance of payments on the current account. We're not going to cover balance of payments because it's going to be covered in the year 13 stuff. So let's focus on these three in a lot of detail because the question will always be about these objectives and the three policies. So let's start with inflation. Inflation is when there is a rise in average prices. The target for inflation is 2%. What is bad about high inflation? I'll do it. So first of all, if prices rise, that doesn't matter on its own. It's only bad if, and obviously this would be the case, but make sure you say it. Inflation is bad if prices are rising and wages are not. If prices are rising and wages are not rising, then people have lower disposable incomes. If people have lower disposable incomes, their living standards get worse. What would happen then is, so you don't have to stop there. There's so much more to say. So if people have low wages and high prices, people will go to their bosses and ask for higher wages. And then one of two things will happen. So after asking for higher wages, then firms would either give the higher wages and then raise prices more, or they would sack some workers, lay off some workers. And if you sack workers, then it will lead to unemployment. And if people lose their jobs, then they'll have low disposable incomes again. And living standards will get even worse. And also AD would fall and the economic growth that would have happened before would also slow down. But maybe prices will go back down, so it could be natural as well. But the main thing is always don't talk about how stuff is expensive or how there's a cost of living crisis without saying disposable incomes. And that's because wages are not rising as fast as prices. And always try and end it with something along the lines of living standards. So that's why inflation is bad. What about so deflation is when there's a fall in prices. Why is that bad? Why is it bad if prices are falling? Deflation is bad because well, first of all, on paper, it might sound like good to an average person because prices are going down. That might sound good, but that's really, really bad because people who are going to make big purchases, such as a TV or a microwave or a sofa or a dining table or a car, okay, what are they going to do? They're not going to buy anything. They're going to wait. So people delay spending because they know that price is going to be lower next month. People don't buy because they're like, oh, it's cheap. People will delay spending because they think it will be cheaper and cheaper. And that's really, really bad for the economy in so many ways. And once again, to make a good answer, a very good answer, we're going to keep explaining. So people delay spending because of big purchases because prices are going down. That means AD would fall because C falls, like consumer spending. And if AD falls, then we have even more deflation. Okay. And if AD falls, people lose their jobs because there's not enough demand in the economy, and there could be an even bigger recession. And if there's a big recession, there would be even more deflation, and it's just a crazy spiral. And you can add so many things in, like low confidence, uncertainty. And that's really bad for the economy. So everything's going to go downhill whenever there's a sign of deflation. The only other important thing is just a couple of definitions. So disinflation is when there's a fall in the rate of inflation. And the other one is just the difference between demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. So demand pull inflation is when AD goes up. Cost push inflation is when SRAS goes up. I mean left. So cyclical unemployment. So there's two main types of unemployment. With essays, there's also other types like seasonal and frictional, but we don't need to worry about that for big questions. So cyclical is when there's low AD in the economy. And the way to remember that is that cyclical sounds like the word cycle. And in the economic cycle, in a recession, the key characteristic is low AD. And then for structural, it's unemployment that happens due to when an industry declines and people don't have transferable skills. It's really important to know the difference between these two because the question could be about unemployment, but an average student is not going to go into detail about the cause of the unemployment. And the good student is going to be able to explain the effects and also say policies according to the type of unemployment. So, for example, when there's low AD in the economy, you're going to jump straight to demand side policy. So, the demand side policies are fiscal and monetary policy. And for structural, you would use supply side policies and even better specific ones depending on what the actual issue is. But we're going to come to these policies in a second. What is economic growth? An increase in the anyone?
Output. I swear it's the
So economic growth is when there's an increase in real GDP in the economy. And real GDP is the total value of goods and services produced in the economy. That's what you were talking about. And then the next thing that's important for economic growth is the two types of economic growth. So what is short run economic growth and what is long run economic growth? Short run economic growth is an increase in real GDP caused by, so still say the first part, but say caused by an increase in AD. And long run economic growth is an increase in real GDP caused by an increase in LRAS or productive potential. And again, these two have different effects. Before we look at the effects, let's just consider an economic cycle. So these are positive output gaps. And these are negative output gaps. And also these are booms. These are recessions. And in between you have downturns and recoveries. A positive output gap is when actual growth is bigger than trend growth. And a negative output gap is when trend growth is bigger than actual growth. And when I say trend, I basically mean capacity. When your growth is bigger than capacity, or when your growth is smaller than capacity. So if there's a positive output gap, you're above capacity, and that's going to be associated with inflation. And this is going to be associated with a recession or deflation. And depending on which situation we're in as an economy, you need to target short run or long run economic growth. accordingly. And that's really important to get the top marks in macro as well, not just talking about economic growth, talking about which type you need. So if the question is about a recession or about deflation or low AD, you need short run economic growth. And how do you achieve short run economic growth? By using demand side policies. So fiscal and monetary. And the only way to achieve long run economic growth is by supply side policies. Cool. So what is fiscal supply side monetary policy? Fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation to influence AD. Keep the definition nice and simple so it's easy to remember. What is monetary policy? Is the use of interest rates or the money supply to influence AD. And supply side policy is the use of various policies to influence LRAS. And there's multiple different types of them. So spend money on education and training, spend on infrastructure, lower benefits, lower corporation tax, lower income tax, and also other stuff like privatization or anything that creates better incentives. And these just force people to have, these two force people to have greater productivity. AD is the total planned spending in the economy. And I always just like to say this when I'm defining it. AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So these are the factors that shift AD, nothing else. And underneath that, we have various things like, so for consumption or consumer spending, interest rates, disposable income, confidence, uncertainty. These are the things that will affect consumer spending. And then for investment or firm spending, also interest rates. Also confidence, but business confidence. And then for government spending, we have things like the state of the economy. So government spending is the only one that will be higher when there's a recession or lower when there's like a nice state of the economy. And then X minus M is based on exchange rates and also by inflation. So if inflation is high in the UK, people might import more. But also to do with confidence and living standards. With aggregate supply, it depends on if it's SRAS or LRAS. SRAS is anything to do with cost of production. And the main costs of production are raw material prices, wages, machinery, or anything that costs money. Exchange rates, if you're importing a lot of stuff. And LRS is completely different. It's all about incentives to work harder or to be more creative. So incentives, technology, those kind of things. So if we go back to AD, these things are really important because AD is a simple topic. So to go into more detail, you need to talk about things like confidence and how that affects the multiplier. So the multiplier is when it's the letter K and it's the change in GDP or national income divided by the change in government spending. So if the government spending increases by a certain amount, maybe on roadworks, then the staff might go to a restaurant or to get a coffee. And then these people might go out for dessert and they might tip people along the way or spend money in different ways. So overall, the initial spending on the economy creates more spending, but that's likely to be high if confidence is high, and it's going to be low if confidence is low. So you can use that to evaluate your demand side policies, especially fiscal policy. The other one we talked about was the accelerator theory, and it's kind of similar, but it's about investment from firms. And it just says that firms get encouraged or excited to invest increases when the state of the economy is good. So this sounds like common sense. You'd probably know that anyway, that firms would invest more when economic growth is high because they think that people will spend more on their goods and services, so they're more likely to invest. So it's not like anything you didn't know, but it's the name. It's just something to give a name to that effect. So when you're talking about it, you can just say that this is the accelerated theory. And therefore, if you want firms to invest more, you have to first get the economy to grow. But that's difficult if firms are not investing in the first place. One more equation for the multiplier is that it's 1 over 1 minus MPC. MPC is your marginal propensity to consume. And marginal propensity to consume is how much of an extra pound you get that you would spend compared to the rest which you would save. And that also depends on confidence. So that is really, really important. So fiscal policy is really, really, really important. So the good thing is it's one of the best policies or the most important policies if we're in a recession. The reason that it's important during a recession is because a recession is when there is very low AD. You can use monetary policy too, and we'll come to that, but confidence might be low. So it's really important that the government are the ones that start the spending and boost confidence slowly by increasing spending in the economy, giving people more benefits or increasing spending on infrastructure or on roads or events like Eat Out to help out in order to get people to spend money. If fiscal policy is continued after escaping the recession, it would lead to inflation. Another bad thing about fiscal policy is that it involves higher government spending or lower taxes if it's expansionary, and that means that the budget deficit would get worse. If the budget deficit gets worse, that increases national debt, which is an accumulation of the budget deficit every year. And if national debt is high, then it's difficult to take out borrowing and spending in the future. And also a future generation would have to undergo austerity, which is when government spending is less than tax revenue. If taxes are high or if government spending is low, then that could lead to lower living standards. And also, if there is austerity, there's a chance of having deflation or a recession again, and then you'd have to spend more money in the economy. So it has to be very well balanced where you don't overpay and cause a need for austerity in the future. So another thing that's really important, it could be on the good side or the bad side, probably the bad side, is that you need to consider the multiplier carefully before you implement fiscal policy. If the multiplier is low, then your increase in government spending is going to have a small effect on the economy. And chances are you need to use fiscal policy when there's a recession and you desperately need to spend money. But when there's a recession, the multiplier would be low. So you're not going to get much value for your government spending, although it has to be done and it might still be the best way to get out of a recession. And then the last thing is a bit fancier and it's called the crowding out effect. it kind of is similar to the point about how a future generation would have to pay for the government spending. But another way is that the government can finance the spending by selling more bonds and borrowing money from rich companies and rich individuals. So the government will sell bonds, so they'll basically borrow money which they can spend on the economy. But if the people with a lot of money are basically lending it to the government, then they're also going to be more in a saving mindset that they're investing into government bonds. And then they're not going to spend on the economy that they would have spent anyway. So you're crowding out the effect of the increased spending by disincentivizing certain people to spend. So it cancels out the effect of it. The next one is monetary policy. So the first thing again is that you need to influence demand in a recession, so it will not be necessary. Another good thing about monetary policy is that while fiscal policy has a budget that's been set every year in every April, monetary policy can be so bank rates can be adjusted every month by the Bank of England. So it's very flexible. So whenever something needs to be changed, the first thing you do, whenever inflation gets too high or too low, the first thing you're going to do is change the bank rates and therefore change interest rates. A good thing or a bad thing is that exchange rates can be affected by interest rates. For example, if interest rates are high, then people in the UK have a high reward for saving. So the currency might go up because it might be in more demand. But if you lower interest rates, then the currency might devalue, and then that might cause other problems. But that would depend on the question which we have. And then another thing is that interest rates are limited. They can't go below 0%. So if we're in a recession, chances are interest rates are already going to be quite low, and you can't keep lowering them more and more, whereas the government can keep spending more and more if it's desperate and if there is a recession. So it's very limited. But in year 13, you learn that there is a similar alternative to monetary policy, which is quantitative easing. So quantitative easing is when the government electronically create money. They then lend this out to banks and building societies and big institutions, and the institutions would then have a larger money supply to loan out to consumers. So they'd be able to lower interest rates that way because of the higher money supply. So you're still lowering interest rates, but without actually lowering the bank rate. And then what happens is over time, it might be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later, when all the money comes back, because the money was created electronically, the money just gets deleted from the system. So they're basically borrowing from themselves, from their future selves. The last point about interest rates is that say there's deflation of 3%, and say interest rates are 1%. So if there's deflation of 3%, the inflation rate is minus 3%. Okay. So then real interest rates would be 1 minus 3, which is 4%. Okay. Because in order to get real interest rates, you're accounting for inflation. So if you minus the minus 3%, interest rates would still be very high. And if people actually take into account real interest rates, then even a 1% or a 0% interest rate would not be effective during a recession. But in general, the demand side policies are very helpful when the state of the economy is something like this. So we have real GDP, price level. And I like to draw my AS curve like this, but you don't have to. If we have AD, which is here, we can easily get AD up to here by using demand side policies. So we've got a low GDP, so low economic growth and high unemployment. And a low price level, or maybe even deflation. So you'd use fiscal or monetary policy in order to get AD1 up to AD2. But what happens if you keep on doing that is that you get less and less growth and more inflation. So in order to grow further from that point, you'd prefer supply side policies because supply side policies are good when there's a positive output gap. So that would mean your aggregate supply curve would go out to the right. And then we'd be able to get more growth. So suppose we go to 83. We're keeping prices stable. They're barely going up. Or in fact, they'd be going down if you stayed at the same AD curve. And you're getting way more economic growth. Okay, so that's really important. Balancing short-run economic growth, followed by long-run economic growth, followed by short-run economic growth, followed by long-run economic growth. Because when there's deflation or recession, you need to boost AD. And when inflation is high, you need to boost LRAS and the capacity of the economy more in order to grow more again. The only downside about supply side policy, so it's good, very good, if there is inflation or a positive output gap. And it's good to prevent, to keep prices stable and also to grow more. The only bad thing is if we think about HS2, I think it's cost around 100 billion, but you can Google that, and over 10 years. And therefore, with most supply side policies, they are very, very expensive. So there's an opportunity cost. And also that could affect the budget deficit and national debt and a very big time lag because it's difficult to affect incentives very quickly. So even if you spend money on education and training, or you spend money building a new train line, you're gonna have a high cost, and it's gonna take a lot of time for the effect to happen on productivity. Even if you're doing the other things, which are more free market based, so these are market based, you're still costing the government because you're lowering taxes. It's still a form of tax revenue which would have come in before. And if you lower income tax or corporation tax, it's not like you're going to lower it for 1 year. You're going to lower it permanently in order to keep that incentive. So you're losing so much money every single year. The only one that doesn't cost money is to lower benefits. So if you reduce the spending of money on benefits, then that can incentivize more people to try and work. But then there's other effects such as inequality, and some people really need benefits if they struggle. Only thing I'd reiterate that's really important is that whenever the question says something like, is the most effective way, or what it will lead to in terms of macroeconomic objectives, or economic consequences for the UK economy, assess the impact of something on the UK economy. All of these things is something a desirable objective. Every single time it says this. So basically, 3/4 of the time in macroeconomics, always just think about when you're planning, think about how does this thing in the question affect the four objectives, which are low inflation, unemployment, low unemployment, economic growth, and balance of payments, because by doing that, you're automatically going to end up answering the question. And then go back in this video and remember, what did we do in order to say why high inflation is bad, or why is deflation bad? And that's why we need that inflation. So whenever we're talking about the effects, you talk about inflation, you talk about, and then you go on further and you explain why deflation is bad, or why the outcome is